I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be diving into the 1950s and doing pretty much about half of the movies due to sort of the series coming to an end pretty soon. Eventually we're going to be getting into Oscar season, and that should be a lot of fun. I expect to do some different things with this season, so stay tuned, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. But this is a series that, if you're new to the channel, what I do every single week is a look at a film that's been nominated for Best Picture. We start with the year 1988. We've been working backwards. We're now with the year 1959. So I look at a Best Picture nominee that I believe has been forgotten, a film that has not been as well remembered, or hasn't been talked about, or critically acclaimed, or hasn't had sort of revivals or retrospectives. It's sort of fallen out of touch with sort of people and how they reclaim and think about the past, and how certain movies sort of sustain the test of time, and others maybe don't age as well, and some just get lost in the mix. So I look at the 5 nominees that year because I think it's very crucial to understand the Oscar history, to understand why a movie got nominated. I also give my thoughts on it as I'm seeing many of these movies for the very first time. I also try to answer that central question as to why it's been forgotten, why this movie and not another movie. Does it always have to do with quality, or are there other factors that may be involved? So, jumping into our very first nomination, we're going to be looking at the Best Picture winner, Ben Hur. This will not be forgotten. I think this is a movie that has sort of defined the classic religious epic, of course, by director William Wyler, who we talked about. He had his own Masters of Control Chaos episode, where he's done many great films. So I think people, once they explore William Wyler, they'll explore his films, and Ben Hur is one of the seminal films in that catalog. Plus, it's just sort of a seminal, like I said, religious epic, which was a genre that really started with Ben Hur. You know, there's things like the Ten Commandments, and for example, there were other sort of previous movies. You could say Bridge on the River Kwai is kind of an epic in a sense. But that's really inspired a lot of these epics, whether it be Ten Commandments, whether it be Lawrence of Arabia, whether it be Cleopatra. These big budgeted sort of period pieces that sort of span decades, and generally about one main character and sort of his sort of progression through time. And this one, because of its success and because of it winning 11 Oscars, it's very crucial. And speaking of those 11 Oscars, this is going to be known, at least in Oscar history. Even if it's sort of not as well remembered and liked and recommended, it will still be remembered in Oscar history, because this is tied with Titanic and Lord of the Rings: Return of the King for the most amount of wins at the Oscars, with a total of 11. So it was a massive, massive sweep. The year that we're going to be covering next year, which would be last year in relation to this, Gigi had 9 nomination wins as well, but this one blew it out of the park and has still yet to be beat, and I'm very unsure if it'll ever be beat. But so I didn't want to talk about that. We also have Anatomy of a Murder was another nominee. This is from director Otto Preminger, who we've talked about briefly before. He's a well-acclaimed director. I sort of group him within guys like Billy Wilder and Alfred Hitchcock, these sort of foreign directors that came and worked within the Hollywood studio system and found a lot of success. Of course, he has some other classics that I would consider him still being a relevant filmmaker. 2 films being probably Laura and Advise and Consent. So he's a director I think that is sustained in relevant film-going culture, so I didn't want to go with him. Another director who I think has been well regarded in terms of his body of work is George Stevens, the director of the next nominee, The Diary of Anne Frank. He's a very interesting director, where before World War II, he was very much the comedy guy. He did, Ginger Rogers in a Fred Astaire movie, like Swing Time. So sort of this musical comedy, of course. Gunga Din, which is very much inspired Indiana Jones, and this sort of serialized adventure film that's very rollicking and fun. And then World War II happens, and then he does A Place in the Sun and Shane, and of course The Diary of Anne Frank. I mean, these really gloomy, dark films with sort of morally ambiguous, I guess you would say, characters. Maybe less so this one, but they're very much dark tones and dark themes, and very much a shift post-World War II, and clear that the war had an effect on him in that sense. And this is one of his late period films about The Diary of Anne Frank, a young Jewish girl hiding, based on a true story, of course, if you don't know, but based on a young Jewish girl hiding from the Nazis, and her recollection. I would sort of group him with sort of the other 30s, 40s studio American directors that are not foreigners. So I'd look at the guys like Frank Capra, William Wyler, John Ford. I would group him in that sort of category. Very much the sort of 5 came back. Great book, and even better, I would say, Netflix series, talking about these American directors that went over to World War II and captured and made a lot of movies. And then the next nominee nominee we have here is The Nun Story. This is from director Fred Zinnemann, who is, we talked about last week, sort of is an Oscar god, had 10 nominations total just for himself, 4 Oscar wins. He's just a director that hasn't been as well talked about and well remembered. So in a way, I could have maybe done The Nun Story, but looking at all of his films, I figured that this is maybe not a pinnacle one, a central one that we can necessarily talk about. We may go out without talking about Fred Zinnemann in depth, but I thought last week I did a pretty good job just sort of summarizing his influence and sort of a strange reasoning as to why he has been remembered, despite his films actually, a lot of them being well remembered. So the sort of nominee I decided to go with was this sort of melodrama, A Room at the Top. It is very much so a melodrama. So I guess transitioning to my thoughts now, I should really define what a melodrama is, because especially into the 50s, and I think next week's episode, which I plan on doing separate tables, is very much a melodrama from what I've heard. So that will be interesting to see that one and really understand this, because at this time, really late 40s and into the 50s, I think the melodrama is really at its peak. Of course, the sort of most famous directors being Douglas Sirk or Max Ophuls. I would, I guess, describe melodrama as a heightened drama. Not mellow in terms of cool, but mellow in terms of overly dramatic in a lot of ways. Things are heightened. If it's very much emotions are heightened, or the score is heightened to really try and manipulate you and try to get those emotions out of you. And the characters, if they're in love, it's the most glorious love of all time. Or if they're sad, it's the most depressing, tragic thing to ever happen to them, and the storylines sort of revolve around that. Another sort of key part, I think, about melodrama is that oftentimes, instead of showing with their actions, a lot of times they just say their feelings, and it's very much seen as sort of the straight, narrow edge kind of a movie. In terms of, it's funny at all, it's dramatic, and it's heightened dramatic, so that to really, I think, overemphasize that element of someone's life, or really overemphasize that tragedy. And I think actually the best, for a lot of people, melodrama is a pejorative. I think many people today, if they were to see a melodrama like this movie, for example, might sort of criticize it as sort of cheesy acting or over the top, especially as, into sort of the 70s, we have this more method acting, the Stanislavski, Stella Adler kind of more subtle acting, whether it be sort of the guys of Brando, or Brando, of course, is still in this period, but really much so the Dustin Hoffmans, the Robert De Niro's in the 70s, really sort of changing the way American acting has been formed. And melodrama sort of got lost in this way. But I think the best melodramas, even though it's kind of used as a pejorative to sort of knock down a movie, I think there's sort of recently has, at least, and I agree as myself, seen sort of a appreciation of them, because as a sort of a certain genre of films, and guys like Douglas Sirk and Max Ophuls in particular have gotten a lot of love and appreciation. And I think they do it best because the director has the most control, and it's very much finding the right balance in a lot of ways. I give the example of Mildred Pierce, which I do think is a melodrama, where a lot of times she's just worrying about her kids and her business, and she's so caught up in everything that it's almost bubbling up in a lot of ways. She's putting it off, she's putting off her emotions. So when the emotions do happen, in a lot of ways, they're so over the top, but they're earned because there's that right balance of sort of these smaller moments, but also these big emotional moments, because it comes from an understandable place. We understand why Mildred's sort of at this emotional height. It also helps that, these are very crucial times in her life, of course condensed within 2 hours, but of course the film takes place over multiple years. So I think that that's sort of my definition, I guess, of melodrama. But the film that just briefly we'll talk about, A Room at the Top, very interesting, sort of a political, in a lot of ways, social hierarchy climbing kind of a movie about a man from the country who plans on marrying the sort of richest man of the world's daughter, very much so as a predatory aspect and a social, trying to rise in the social ranks than it is a love-based thing, but then actually falls in love with an older woman, and it's kind of a love triangle in a lot of ways. It's very interesting to see sort of a misguided ambition. It's a complex character. He's not necessarily a heroic in a lot of ways, which maybe that's the reason why I did enjoy the ending as much, just because I'm not sure if it has to do with the motion picture code or not, but I felt that he was sort of redeemed in a way that I didn't think was as appropriate, or would have been as done maybe today. He wouldn't have got off as scotch-free. But there is sort of still a melancholy and sort of a darkness that overrides the film, because we know that this guy is not doing it out of pure intentions. It has to do with a calculated risk in terms of rising those social ranks, in terms of worrying about money. And this is sort of a common theme that we often see, people coming from these lower income families who are very smart, who try to sort of raise their social rank and for future generations, or gain money, and then in a lot of ways maybe lose themselves or their purpose in life, or even their happiness, and trying to do things because it will increase your social status instead of your happiness. And I think this film really sort of delves into that, and it's really sort of a tight, well-written screenplay, a movie I enjoyed for its themes and how its sort of structure goes throughout, a fast-paced movie in that sense as well. So why has it been forgotten? I think melodrama just isn't a genre anymore. I think a lot of ways, drama is hard to do. Either it's The Dark Knight and it's the best thing ever, or it's Batman v Superman and it's corny and the Martha scene doesn't work. But in The Dark Knight, when Rachel's screaming Bruce, that does work, right? Because it's well done and it's paid off. But I think if you want to make sort of a generally amusing film, comedies a lot of the ways. I think modern day films, a lot of, especially Marvel films, are maybe the main criticism of them, and the main sort of perpetrator of them is when they have these emotional scenes, but they don't let these emotional scenes really play out, and they sort of undercut it with humor. I actually like that about Endgame, is that the first hour and a half is all darkness and bleakness and sort of grief that the other Marvel films don't do, which is why I appreciate that film so much. One of my favorites of the year so far. But I think that the genre, in a sense, people aren't necessarily allowed in a lot of ways to be sort of big and grandiose, because I think a lot of people would see it as corny and overacting and wouldn't sort of garner that sympathy. So that's just the taste as of right now. It could change. I think if you understand and appreciate this genre as a certain genre and understand the director's control of it, where you do like something like Mildred Pierce, or you do like sort of the Douglas Sirk films, or Max Ophuls' Earrings of Madame D. There's a lot to be learned about that, and a lot to love about that. So that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know some of your favorite melodramas. And if you like some of these directors, Oliver Preminger, George Stevens, I'd love to hear it in the comments down below. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.